Hello and welcome back to another episode of Adventist A. I'm your host, Kevin, and today we're joined by Reverend Dr. Ross Lockhart, who is the professor of mission studies at Vancouver School of Theology, my graduate school. So, love VST, so I'm excited to hear more about it. So, thank you for joining us today, Ross.
What a pleasure to be with you and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear a bit more about your journey. I find the guests step into the journey of stepping into your subject matter is very life enriching. So I always like to start with that question. Well, how did you end up here? How did you end up as a Reverend Doctor, which is quite the cool title, and now professor of mission studies? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it has been a remarkable journey, and one certainly that is deeply connected to God's faithfulness. So, born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which for some of your listeners they'll be familiar with. If your podcast listeners are joining you from the States, just think north of North Dakota. There is something north of North Dakota. And that's where I grew up, and wonderful family there. Large, kind of extended family of mostly immigrants from Northern Ireland. So that's where my Presbyterian heritage comes from. And grew up in a loving family, involved in the local church, and in my teen years, through a series of experiences, had a sense of call to ministry and wasn't quite sure what that meant as far as did that mean just being an active layperson in the church, or did it mean more? And during my undergraduate or first degree was actually in history at the University of Winnipeg, and in some ways, history is still my first love as a subject. And I started working as the youth minister at my home congregation, and so that was a good opportunity to try formal ministry leadership, almost with. Oh, you could say almost with training wheels on. So an opportunity to see the church in all of its beauty, but also all of its political fraughtness behind the scenes. It was a chance, without having jumped in with both feet, to kind of take a peek behind the curtain and say, "Oh, that's what Christians are like." And yet, despite being eyes wide open, or perhaps because of being eyes wide open, I continue to sense that call to lead God's people. And so finished my first degree and moved to Toronto and completed a Master of Divinity at the University of Toronto. And that was a wonderful time in my life, a great opportunity. It was an ecumenical based education, similar to what you're receiving at Vancouver School of Theology. So I'd be mixing with people from different denominational backgrounds, having professors from different denominational backgrounds. And then from there, I was always kind of one foot in the church, one foot in the academy or the university, and trying to figure out how to honor both of those calls as I went further. I know I had a full PhD scholarship when I graduated with my MDiv, which I said no to. And I think I know I kind of broke my supervisor's heart in not continuing on because I wanted to be ordained. I wanted to serve the church, and serve the church in places like Nova Scotia, north of Maine, and Ontario, of course, which is our most populous province, and some wonderful ministries there. And then out here on the West Coast. But while doing so, I started to work away on both my first and then my second doctorate. And so my first doctorate is in homiletics or preaching. And that really came out of my love of congregational ministry and my love of worship. But the further I went in ministry, and this is probably connected the most to your question, is the further I went in ministry, the more I realized that more and more of my neighbors were not interested in any way in Christianity, right? I grew up in what I call the fumes of Christendom, where everyone in my elementary school class was Christian of some kind, right? And then by the time I got into my adult years in ministry, I was recognizing more and more that Canadians were having little to do with the church or even had very little faith background. And when I moved to Vancouver, that became particularly clear that here people are on their third or fourth generation raised without any religious connection. And so that had me diving more deeply into the question of mission. What does mission look like in a North American landscape where more and more people have no Christian background or understanding? So that's what the second doctorate was focused on, which we can chat a little bit later, and some of the work that I've produced out of that interest in mission.
So what is kind of a defining way to talk about missional theology or
Mm,
practical theology? Like there's so many forms of theology which I hadn't encountered until I came to VST.
yeah.
And then when I went through your class and you're like, we're gonna do practical theology, I'm like, what does this mean? Like, what? And I remember being like, okay, like there's different forms of theology. Like, what is this? So how would
Yeah,
you?
that's so good.
Yeah, I was kind of like, wait a minute, we're
Yeah.
putting a descriptive on the word theology here.
That's right. That's right. And you're so funny. I always need to like go to these painful lengths because I am so blessed by great colleagues who do different kinds of theological work, right? So we have colleagues in biblical studies, and I'm so grateful. I was just before this podcast writing my Sunday sermon for a church here in Vancouver and consulting commentaries and thinking, I'm so glad there are people who do this kind of work on our behalf, right? We have folks in the historical end of theology, and that's wonderful. And then, of course, we have folks in systematic theology, the doctrine side of our various Christian traditions, and that's also really important. And I tend to stress, and you may recall in class, I tend to stress that the language of practical theology is fraught because it might imply that other forms are impractical, but they're not. They're super important, super, super important. I'm so glad. And I still read and enjoy systematic theologians and so forth. What practical theology really means, and this would be someone, a great theologian like John Swinton at the University of Aberdeen, would say that practical theology it's like critical theological reflection on the practices of the church as they interact with the practices of the world, right? So how are Christians actually living out their faith, and what, if any, impact does that have on the world around them? So that's where you start to see the tie into mission. Now, under practical theology fall many different categories. And I often think of them in terms of like a golf umbrella as practical theology, and underneath are all these other ones. So preaching is under there, ethics, evangelism, mission, pastoral care, liturgics, right? Liturgical studies. All of those fall under the broad umbrella of practical theology. And mission would certainly be the area that I tend to focus the most.
And like you said in your research towards this, which is kind of an interesting thing that I wanted to spend some
Mhm.
time thinking about and talking through is what does that missional study or approach mean in Canada? This is a Canadian podcast thinking about what is Canadian society or the Canadian scene.
Yeah.
So, what are some things that you have noticed or bring out the uniqueness of practical theology in Canada?
Absolutely. So, to kind of yoke it to this question around missional theology as a term would be fairly new in the last few decades. And where it really comes, there's any number of people you can point to. David Bosch in South Africa is a wonderful practical theologian who helped shape this discussion. Leslie Newbigin in the United Kingdom was a huge player in that. He, of course, was a missionary in India for decades from the 1930s on, helped found the Church of South India. And then when he returned to the United Kingdom, he was surprised at how secular it had become. And so the nation, the so-called nominally Christian nation in the 1930s that sent him by the 70s and 80s was now overwhelmingly secular. And so he started to ask, well, wait a minute, we used to send people out of the West to tell other people about Jesus, the old kind of sending model. What if that was reversed? And what if now the mission field was the West instead? And so missional theology takes seriously that mission is not just one aspect of the church's work, but it's actually the very nature of who God has revealed himself to be. So as the Father sends the Son, sends the Spirit, the church is sent. We're participating with God in this ministry and this mission. And the mission field in Canada is particularly tricky. And so my colleague Daryl Guter, who I've worked with for a number of years, was the editor of Missional Church, has often remarked that the Canadian scene is far more European in its church scene than the States. And by that, what many scholars mean is that we are much further along the secularization pathway. And so, unlike in America, where the US government does not ask citizens their religious preference or perspective. And so you have wonderful research institutes like the Pew Research Institute that kind of tries to do that. In Canada, since the 19th century, the Canadian government has asked its citizens every 10 years, what's your religious affiliation? So we have incredible data on how Canadians identify. And so the 2021 census has revealed some significant trends in the way in which Christians are now a minority in many parts of the country, including here in British Columbia, where 34% of the population identifies as Christian. And remember, that's only how people identify. That's not, are they members? Do they regularly attend? It's simply identification. And here in the city of Vancouver, where I live and minister, Christianity is very much a minority expression. And the majority expression is secular, or those who tell the government, I have no religion. And so I've been doing some research work and publishing on that over the last few years. So yeah, taking seriously that more and more the neighbor we encounter, especially the domestic born, we can talk about the influence of immigration after if you're interested, but domestic born will be people for whom there is no core understanding or expression or past history of Christianity, which is why in traditional kind of evangelical circles, the language of revivalism is often popular. When you attend more evangelical expressions of Christianity, they'll be praying for the city and asking God to send revival and so forth. And my Dr. Vader or PhD supervisor, Stefan Pass, would often say the problem in post-Christendom is there is nothing to revive. So the language of revival is actually not appropriate. You can talk about witness, you can talk about evangelism, you can talk about inviting people to become a Christian, but the language of revivalism is a bit misleading. It would be like if we gathered around a campfire hours after it had gone out, right? And there's nothing to actually, we can start a new fire, we can start a fire, but you can't just throw a few logs on and hope for it to come back. So that's how mission is changing. It's a fascinating expression of the church's work.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, if there's nothing there to revive, right? So it's kind of starting. It's not necessarily even starting from square one because it's not like these are, empty tablets of people waiting
No,
to be Christianized. There is still formation of our society is geared more and more against religion.
right.
So it's not like you're speaking to somebody with nothing. You're speaking with somebody that probably has a preformed idea. They don't really want anything to do with a church.
That's right. And I think that may be one difference. Well, it depends for your podcast listeners in the States. There's a whole other series of factors that might have US citizens who are not Christian turn away from the church. But certainly in Canada, one of the major factors is the history of colonialism and the treatment of Indigenous peoples. And so, primarily through, at least media-wise, what people would understand most readily would be the history of residential schools going back to the 19th century, where the Canadian government wanted to westernize Indigenous or First Nations. For your American listeners, the language still is used often Native American. In Canada, it would be Indigenous, First Peoples, and basically contracted out these residential schools that Indigenous children were taken from their homes and sent to where there was terrible abuse that took place, spiritual, physical, sexual abuse, well documented. And the churches gladly participated in what essentially is a program of genocide. And so, for most secular people today, when they hear church, it's not a default sense of good. There's a missiologist, a Canadian missiologist, which would be another kind of fancy way of describing the area I work in, mission studies. It's kind of a $10 cocktail party word, but missiologist. Um, Named Sam Chase. And he's written in his studies of Christianity in Canada and the broader secular culture. He says that there's something that's different now in Canadian culture than even 20, 30 years ago. And what he's noted in interviews and different focus groups and so forth is it used to be non-Christians, more secular people would debate whether Christianity is true. Think about kind of the famous angry atheists of Hitchens and Dawkins and so forth from a couple decades ago. What Sam has said, which I find is helpful, is more and more he's finding people who struggle with Christianity, not whether it's true, but whether it's good for the broader society. And you catch the difference there? Like that's quite a significant change. 20 years ago in congregational ministry, I would always, be at dinner parties and you'd have like the one person who's there, maybe the spouse of someone goes to church and they'd want to corner you and have you read this Hawkins, the Hitchens, Dawkins, like they always wanted to kind of have that conversation. So you'd be geared to kind of do that kind of armchair apologetics kind of work. But that's not the case quite so much anymore. It's now like, okay, well, I'm not even interested in debating whether there's a God or, who Jesus is. All I know is that Christians have done some pretty bad things. So why would I even be interested in that? Is that even good for broader society? So I think we just find ourselves in a different place when it comes to Christian witness. And you're right, people do not come blank slate. They come with all kinds of preloaded experiences and beliefs. But as a Christian, I have to believe that every single person I encounter is someone with whom not only A, are they made in the image of God, but I really believe B is someone with whom the Holy Spirit is already having a conversation. Whether they would use that language or not, they probably wouldn't use that language at all. But I honestly believe, like when I encounter people in my community and that kind of thing. I think here's someone that God loves, that Christ died to save, and that God's working in their life in some way. I wonder where the possible connection point might be with that person.
Yeah, but even then, as you describe that, you can see if you're coming towards somebody, your neighbor, with I see the spirit in you, I see the image of
Yeah,
God. But then your neighbor's like, no, I don't want any of that junk because look what it
right.
did, right? Like where
Yeah,
was that with the residential schools? And yeah,
yes.
and that's a hard piece to navigate, and especially in reverence to the states, I think,
Mm,
right, where they're becoming more Christian nationalistic. They're using their faith to adjust to justify conversations on abortion and all these other things.
right.
And in Canada, we're not American,
Yeah,
we kind of look with a bit of pride, being like, oh, we don't have that issue, right? There's
right.
been there's been queer marriage in Canada since 2003. Like that was, that passed within a year. Like that was easy. Where
Yeah,
you're still figuring that out.
right.
And I think that plays into what you're saying is our conversation of is it good is a national thing, but internationally we see these conversations and debates, and we're like, no, we don't want that.
Right.
So it's almost like we're trying to save ourselves from some of these issues by engaging them with a big distance, being like, no, in Canada, we don't have that.
That's right. And I think that the secularity is different. West Coast secularity, where we live in British Columbia, is a secularity that's kind of a kindler, gentler secularity towards Christianity. And part of that is Christianity was never, well, you can argue this, but scholars would argue that Christianity was never as fully entrenched here as in other parts of the country. And so your listeners might be interested in some really good work that's been done. And I confessed earlier that history is still my first love. So I love reading historians. There's a wonderful historian at the University of Victoria named Lynn Marks. And she has a book with a title probably designed to sell books. And it's called Infidels and the Damn Churches. Great title. And the subtitle is Religion and Irreligion in Settler British Columbia in the 19th Century. And she makes the case that the Christian church was never fully established here, that this part of the country, and I think your American listeners would identify with Washington State and with Oregon and California as well, that the West Coast in general was the place that people came, in our case, mostly young men in the 19th century. Why did they come here? They came here to make it rich. It's an extraction economy, the gold rush, fishing, lumber, and they made money to go somewhere else, right? And so the church never had the kind of sway here as it did back east, which is why, to your point, when you talk about kind of that desire to push back against any kind of public presence of the church. It's not a big surprise last week when the Premier of Quebec made very clear that he would like to see legislation banning public prayer in the province of Quebec. And so much of Quebecois secularity, even though when you look at the Statistics Canada numbers, a majority of Quebecers still say they're Christian. Now, the overwhelming majority of those would identify with the Roman Catholic Church, but they don't go to Mass, not since the 1960s and the Quiet Revolution. It's almost more like many of us will have friends who are Jewish and they'll say, well, I'm a secular Jew, right? So it's almost more an ethnic marker than a religious marker. And part of that is the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec was completely dominant since New France. And so the pushback is always like against religion. And as I teased a friend in Montreal I was talking to this week, I said, what happens if that law goes through and you want to go Christmas caroling? Because St. Augustine said to sing well is to pray twice. So I guess it's illegal now to sing Christmas carols in public. I doubt anyone will be hauled off to prison for singing Christmas carols, but it says something about kind of in my research on the West Coast, focus groups always tended to report in my latest study that Christians interacting with non-Christians, mostly secular neighbors, the number one phrase that came up was "you do you." Right? Like, hey, that's great. I'm glad you got that thing. I think it's a little weird called religion or whatever, but you do you. I'm going to go do this thing over here. Where I think in parts of North America where the church held a lot more power, baked into the DNA now is kind of a pushback against anything that might restrict or legislate personal freedom.
Well, in Quebec, it's always an interesting thing. It's the anomaly here in Canada for sure.
Yeah,
Everything applies to Canada but Quebec. Like
right.
whether it's
Notwithstanding.
yeah, whether it's the lottery system or whether it's healthcare, it's always except in Quebec
Mhm.
because Canada started as New France, so a French colony, which eventually was taken over by the British. So you have the Quebec Act, which allowed them to continue being French speakers and part of the Roman Catholic faith with their British Protestant overlords.
Correct. And the Napoleonic Code, the legal system is different in
Yeah,
Quebec than the
so
rest of English Canada.
they have a different legal system, and but then part of, like you were mentioning too, part of their view of religion is also different. In my studies of interfaith,
Hmm.
French society does not maintain freedom of religion, it's freedom from religious expression.
Well said.
So
Yeah.
that reversal is seen in France and by default Quebec. because they have a banning on religious garbs and
Yeah.
symbols. And so for a Westerner to hear, or a non-Quebecer to hear that, oh, they're going to ban public prayer and get all tight, it's like, well, actually, in that context,
Yeah.
that kind of fits. Like that makes sense. Like
Right.
you're trying to keep people free from that over um, zealous missionarial focus of I'm going to tell you about Jesus. Like, well, no, actually,
Right.
the public space has to be free from that.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting conversation of is the public space free to talk about religion, but
Mm.
then, like you said, it didn't take root. Is our interactions having to be kept at a home base? So,
Mm.
these aspects are very interesting because religion, I think, is taken on as kind of, the clothes you put on,
Right.
whereas deep spirituality is part of who you are. Like,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Good.
me being bald and brown eye is it's part of who I am, and I can't change that.
Yeah.
So, like you said, the way we approach it is, well, you do you,
Mm.
which is the same phrase I would say to somebody if they're wearing a really weird shirt. Well, you do
Yeah.
you.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's not that. It's actually something deeper. So I had wondered too, through your research and what you've noticed, is there then kind of a failing on the church part to
Mm.
actually be the church and to be, I know the word that comes to mind is integral. Like,
Yeah.
have we failed or let down Canadian society by allowing them to think it's just what you put on? It's a
Right.
simple thing you do, where actually no, there's a depth to it beyond Sunday or Saturday service, beyond that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the normative outcomes from my latest project that was published by McGill Queen's University Press this fall, it's entitled West Coast Mission: The Changing Nature of Christianity in Vancouver, where I embedded in 14 congregations in the city, interviewed the pastors, studied the neighborhood, had focus groups, did participant observation exercises in their worship services. One of the normative outcomes from that project was how congregations can attend more closely to what the Pauline epistles call walking worthily. And so, if churches no longer have the kind of political sway they once had, or in our case on the West Coast, maybe never really had, then what does it look like to both create and foster communities of integrity? And so when we read the New Testament, Pauline epistles, the earliest Christians didn't have political influence. They were small in number, always in a minority expression of the broader population. But we get again and again in these epistles this call to walk worthily, that the way in which Christians move through the marketplace, we might say through the workplace, through the shopping malls, through the hockey rinks, through the soccer pitches, through our communities, should be able to show integrity with what it means to be a baptized follower of Jesus. Now, sometimes we know that that leads to saying no to certain things in society. I mean, the classic argument from the church in Corinth was whether mature Christians could, eat meat that was sacrificed to idols. And as a Winnipegger, I'm all about a good deal. So when I go to the grocery store and I see 50% off meat, I'm like, I'm all over that. So I have some sympathy for the people in Corinth. But it was about modeling for those new believers what it means to be set apart while still in the society. So Daryl Guter, who I mentioned earlier, is a big mentor of mine and editor of Missional Church. His threefold for that kind of integrity, he would always say that witness, Christian witness in a post-Christian world, is about being, doing, and saying. So first, it's about our character. then it's about our actions, and it's also about our speech, what we say, which, in the Adventist tradition, I'm not sure if this is a challenge in the same way it is in mainline Protestantism in Canada, but there are many kind-hearted, morally upright, Jesus-loving mainline Protestants who are more than a little squeamish about actually talking about their faith with other people. Within the safety of a stained glass sanctuary, okay, maybe, fair enough. But as soon as they get outside, they get what I call liturgical laryngitis, and they're a bit afraid to speak. And so, character, action, and speech is there congruence in ways that hopefully make us stand out in that kind of First Peter 3 15 way of always be ready, right? To give an account, to give a testimony, to give a witness to the hope that's within us, and to do so with gentleness and respect. I really love that passage because it implies that there might be something different in the way that we move through the world, that someone would actually say, hey, so, everyone's stressed out at work, but you seem to be handling it better. Why is that, right? Or I've noticed you've been going through a hard time, but you're not collapsing like other people. Or you're really kind to people in a way that other people aren't. What's that about? Whatever it is, surely there must be a calling for us as a minority people in a broader, more secular society to live in a way that draws attention not so much to us, but to the one who's at work in us.
So in that way, it's almost returning not just to the text to understand, oh, how do I do this, but living the life of Corinth and the life
Yeah,
of these early followers of the way, not even Christianity, right? It was just the way,
yeah, right.
and modeling that into, well, yeah, in BC we are the minority. There's the growing religious nuns,
Yeah,
spiritual but not religious.
right.
And I think, like you said, the connection between word and speech is so often the issue that I've had brought to me. Like, you
Yeah,
say you love people, but then you go on YouTube and blast this, or you show
yeah,
up and say God hates so and so, and people look at that and being like, I don't want nothing to do with that.
yeah, that's right. And I think part of it is a fundamental choice that Christians have to make about the way in which they view the world outside Christian community. And this would be a connection to both a sense of mission and missional theology, right? So I'm very ecumenically focused. I love to worship, and I'm always happy to preach in any number of Christian traditions. I may be Reformed in my kind of DNA, in my family background, and certainly happy to be there. It's my default setting. But I love being in different Episcopal spaces, evangelical spaces, Anabaptist spaces. But I'm always listening as a professor of mission. How do people here? Well, I listen for a couple of things. First, how do people here view the world outside this community? And what I mean by that is, do they see it as a dark world abandoned by God, in which they need to have this holy huddle to preserve their purity and piety? Or do they actually use words and expressions that might give an indication that the world outside belongs to God, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and that it's actually a place of potential revelation, right? That they might actually, Road to Emmaus style, meet Jesus this week out in the broader world, because I think the default setting there is going to impact whether you are picking up that placard and saying God hates blank, right? That sense of kind of angry towards the world versus openness and what I would call kind of an expectation of revelation that God might show up. So I look for that. Another thing I look and listen very carefully for when I visit Christian communities is how people talk about God and whether there's a sense of God's active presence, right? So, I'll interview people in churches and say, tell me about what's been going on in this church in the last year. What do you celebrate? And they'll say things like, yeah, we've really pulled together after the pandemic, and we're not as many people as we used to be, but we're starting to get our programs together, and we're working really hard, and we're trying to figure out how to be a good influence in this neighborhood and that kind of thing. Okay. cut, fine, take the notes and that kind of thing. And then I go to another church and ask the same question, tell me what's been going on last year in this church. And they'll say things like, "Oh wow, like we didn't know at all what to do. We were kind of discouraged after the pandemic, but God is so faithful and God keeps showing up. God's been sending us people just when we need. We had a financial crisis last year and we prayed about it, and God sent just in time the right donor that we needed, and we're really excited to see what God's going to do with us." Right? Do you hear the difference between
Yeah.
one is human agency driven, and there is a corresponding connection I've noticed. The more affluent the congregation, the more human agency driven it is. And then there's divine agency. And it's never one or the other, right? I mean, there's that's where we get missional theology. It's the knitting together of divine and human agency. But I'm always curious where the default setting is. And for me, I would just far rather be in a place where they expect God to show up and things to happen.
Yeah, and thinking through your observations and what you've noticed, I would have to say my experience has been more of that isolation. The world is bad, stay
Right.
here. And that denies God's ability to work in the world, which he owns. Like,
Yeah.
and I remember thinking through some of my past history as well, the ironic moments of the sermon and the songs. The world is God, God loves, God created the world, all these beautiful things. But then, like you
Yes.
said, the actual practice is the world is even and broken. We have to save ourselves and run to
Right.
the hills. I remember a lot of my classmates being scared that they had to find a place to hide in the wilderness when the end times came,
Yeah.
and that being a real big conversation during my middle school years.
Yes.
And it's like, well, no, that, like you said, that denies the expectation that God will show up because then it's about you.
Right. Right. That's right. Yeah. And this vision that we're given in Revelation that all of this is moving towards the healing of the nations, as Revelation says. I mean, that's good news, and the sense in which we have to trust that God is active in the world that He's created and redeemed through Jesus.
Yeah, and that's been a huge switch that I've learned at VST is diving into that and
Mm.
seeing like, no, actually God is active. God has shown up
Mhm.
as Professor Dr. Ray would say, God was active even before the Europeans showed up.
Yeah, imagine.
Right? He's spoken a lot about that.
Hmm.
And but then also being attuned to what the scene, what society is, and
Yeah.
realizing that we do have a diminished voice, especially in the West Coast,
Hmm. Hmm.
that we can't deny our connection to our community because I've seen people blame the society for the problems that Christianity has. And it's like,
Yeah.
if they just got their stuff together, if they just realized, it's like, no, they're using their brain. We're just giving them bad examples to understand.
Yeah.
And I've had a lot of clarifying conversations with coworkers. They're like, Kevin, you're Christian, yeah? Well, how this and this and this and this? What?
Yeah.
Or residential schools, are they? And so I walk them through how I've seen it and processed in the context, and they're like, oh, I've never thought of it that way.
Yes.
And I'm
Yes.
like, well, you probably have never been shown that way, right?
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you're only going by the media or what Christians say in the YouTube comic section,
Yeah.
like there's not much good to go on sometimes.
No, that's right. And I always think William Plaker, who is a great Presbyterian theologian many years ago, would say when it comes to the mistakes that Christians have made before us, why do we ever feel the need to defend the indefensible? Like just say, yeah, I mean that was a terrible turn of events, and pray God that we are more alert in this day and age. But we will also be moving through this world because it is a fallen world, beautiful yet broken, and we are redeemed yet still sinners. We will be moving through this world in ways that create pain, and an alertness to that, and the practice of confession and communal discernment, I think, has the potential to minimize that. But like we're still moving through. So I would just think, yeah, rather than trying to go into a defensive mode, to say, yeah, that was terrible. And that's why, for example, with Indigenous peoples, many of the Canadian churches now have issued formal apologies and are working in some way towards reconciliation, which is my own sense is generational, as far as it will take generations to continue working out what it means to be reconciled. And why should we be surprised when you look at other parts of the world where there has been conflict between people groups? It takes generations to work towards, hopefully, some kind of just and equitable solution.
Well, and going back to what you had said at the beginning too, that movement from is God real and just to is religion good?
Hmm.
And I think I've come to a similar thought too, based on interactions and just even the change in the kind of students I've interacted with and taught with too, is they're not even at the God conversation. They're like, what good is this?
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's they see it as a list of rules, a list of you have to be like this, or the fear of the other. And I think that's kind of the key wrestling question, especially here in the West Coast, but across Canada and probably elsewhere too,
Yeah.
is what evidence are we giving that this is good?
Hmm.
What does this bring to somebody's life? Because we jump to, well, if you don't believe in God, you're going to hell, or you're doing this. Like we jump to more scrutiny and more harshness, trying to convince them why it's not harsh.
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah, right, right.
do we not see that kind of as a double negative, proving the point that maybe
Yeah,
there
it
isn't
kind of
anything?
works against us, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I've
Hmm.
wondered about that because I still hear a couple sermons, or I heard a sermon this past summer, like, if life is going bad, well, maybe it's because you're not reading your Bible enough. Like that was kind of the
Oh,
undertone of this one sermon. And I was like,
yeah,
oh my goodness, this is why I get it. I see it. This is why
yeah.
people don't like this. Like,
No,
I,
that's right. Yeah, and for those of us who are committed followers of Jesus, if we have those cheesy, cringy, creepy moments, just imagine. I mean, I've sat in churches where I've said hi to someone and say, "Oh, like we're just new or visiting," and then I hear something like that, and I think, "Oh my gosh, like we are not helping ourselves out here." So, yeah, that's where you have to pray double time that the Holy Spirit is going to either shield their ears from that kind of thing or help them find a compassionate community where they can encounter Jesus in a really powerful and meaningful way.
and I think part of that has been a loss of translation in seeing other people,
Hmm.
right? Because when it comes to residential school, um, those people thought they were doing good,
Hmm.
right? They felt justified that they were bringing the gospel, they were bringing European culture to raise these savages, as it were,
Hmm.
right? Kill the Indian and the child was kind of the official goal.
Hmm.
And I wonder if we still carry that concern of your soul is at stake, but we translate it, we speak about it in a way that the person doesn't recognize. That like we talked about, if I don't believe in God, I'm going to hell. Well, why would I believe in God? So
Hmm.
our concern about, the ultimate is landing in a way that isn't recognized because we're doing a really bad job, right? Christian concern is not secular concern. And I
Right.
wonder if there's a mistranslation between those two worlds that's causing some of the issue.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the what fueled colonialism and the racism inherent in it and the devastating legacy that comes out of that is heartbreaking. To your point, people caught up. I mean, that's why in Christianity we speak in terms of sin as individual sin and corporate sin, right? So if you and I go out and we take someone's bag and steal it, that's individual sin, bad on us. But to be caught up in broader systems of injustice, yeah, I mean that's the way in which we move through the world. And so the question there is always, what are we currently participating in that years from now, we will look back and say, I can't believe we said nothing when blank, or our children or our grandchildren will say that. Like I remember when I was 18, I was backpacking in Europe and I flew over from Canada. I was on an Air France flight and they had just introduced non-smoking on their flights. And I was in row one of non-smoking and in front of me was all smoking. And about halfway across the Atlantic, it dawned on me, we are all in the same tube together. This makes no sense that there is a smoking and a non-smoking section on an airplane. And I thought, one day soon, this is coming to an end, right? But if I had said that to the flight attendant, she or he would have said, "Oh no, this is improvement. This is progress," right? So I mean, we're constantly caught up. This is the nature of human community, and so yeah, I think the dilemma is that and this is where folks like Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor are so helpful when he looks at secularity, is that the conditions of belief are changing, right? So we are now a highly individualistic culture that is resistant to external authority or external kind of truth. And so, for us to say the Bible says to secular people is for them to shrug their shoulders and say, okay, well, why should I care about that, right? So, some of the traditional ways in which we have approached transmission of the gospel are really failing now. And so that's simply a call to think of what might be effective and faithful transmission of the gospel in the time that we find ourselves in. I would say that relational connection, not seeing neighbor as object, but as subject, right? So not just someone to evangelize and move on to them, but someone to truly build meaningful relationships with, in which God is present, and likely more and more kind of personal testimony or witnessing. I don't mean like on the back of a napkin, a script that's been given to you, but people speaking truly out of their lives that have been changed. That's different than a doctrinal truth that's being delivered in a way that just falls flat, right? So I think evidence of lives changed and the ability to articulate it in kind of winsome, compelling ways is certainly much better than kind of the traditional way of trying to convince someone to be a Christian, or to your point, to try and scare them into it. That kind of external motivator just doesn't seem to land as well as it used to, if it ever did, to be honest. Thank
Well, I thank you for your time and for your research. I'm excited to see where it goes in the future
you.
and how you keep developing the ways that, hey, Christianity has meaning, but if it doesn't land, that meaning, I go back to Corinthians, I could have all the wisdom,
Yep.
but without love, I'm a clanging cymbal.
Right.
And so thank
Right.
you for clarifying what love and a clanging cymbal could look like in Canada, but of course the broader Western world of things are changing, and our love might need to be adapted to meet it.
Yeah. Kevin, thanks so much. Always great to be in conversation with you, and to you and your podcast listeners, all very best.
Thanks for listening. Here are some acknowledgments that make this podcast possible. First of all, these conversations are hosted on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Okanagan people. Also, a big thanks to our Spectrum producer, Alexander Carpenter, along with Bryce Hadlock, our editor, Jared Wright, our graphic designer, and Jared Jameson, our audio producer. Conversations like these cannot happen without the continued support of donors like you. So thank you so much for giving to Spectrum and making this possible. Until our next conversation, have a good one, bud.